The most important tip for succeeding with lockdown is to make sure the initial setup is correct. This shot is 1920 by 1080 at 25 frames a second. I'll drag this into a new composition. When I create a new composition out of this, the composition matches the resolution and frame rate, which is absolutely crucial for lockdown to work properly. If you're going to be using the 3D features, which I hope you will, I would highly recommend trimming your footage inside of your composition just like this, but not actually moving it in time. Without boring you into leaving before the tutorial even begins, there are some strange situations that can happen to layer timing in After Effects, like the layer starting on a half frame instead of a whole frame. This will ensure your track is never off by one frame. If I apply the effect here, track it, and press lockdown, the shot is tracked between this point and this point. I get tons of help tickets with people asking how to extend their in and out point after a shot's been tracked. If you set it up this way, it's as easy as doing this and this. And even though there's no tracking data in these areas, you can just as easily reopen lockdown and set it to track again. Now this track was very easily extended, which shows in this composition here. If this composition needs to be part of a larger composition or part of an edit, I would recommend taking the whole thing and then putting that into your edit as a completed composition, and then you can move it however you want, rotate, scale, slide it in time, and you won't have any issues. But the main lockdown comp, please keep the main composition and footage an exact match in terms of frame rate, resolution, in point, and out point. And there are a lot fewer things that can go wrong. I'd also like to point out that some systems in Cinema 4D work best with whole frames. If you try to set your project frame rate, it won't even let you set it to 23976. It's either 23 or 24, which again may lead to your track being off by one frame. So I would highly recommend conforming your shot to whole frame rates if you're going to be using it in Cinema 4D. With that said, let's get started. Go to Effect, Vranos, Lockdown, and press Pop Out. Your hotkeys are here. If you just need to use lockdown as fast as possible, Control-click and drag, Command-click and drag on a Mac, around the area you want to track, and press Track All. Close the pop-out, and press Lockdown. There are now 3 layers. The first is your background, the second is your graphics using a checkerboard placeholder, and the third is hidden, which contains your graphics. Enter the stabilized comp. You can delete the checkerboard, then add your graphics. Tab back to your main comp, and your graphics are tracked. You would want to change your blending layer on the layer that has lockdown on it, because this layer has the graphic. And that's pretty much all you need to know to get started. If you're using the free version of Lockdown, Control-click to create a point, Command-click on Mac, and press Track All. Then select the point and press Create Null Object. Close the pop-out and press 3D Nulls to AE. You don't need the camera, and you don't need this Lockdown 3D plane object, but this Lockdown transform is your null. Bring in your graphics, parent it to the null, and at this point you can shut off lockdown so it doesn't render. Most of the time in lockdown, when you have really clean footage and the movement isn't crazy, you'll get great tracking results like this. There's hundreds of points here, and none of them actually need to be adjusted or changed. Sometimes your footage isn't going to be as easy to track though. For example, in this shot, I'll select this point, and then press Track All. And you'll see that that texture that it was on is actually disappearing slightly at times, so the track is going off. How do we deal with this? In Lockdown, you'll notice that we have this crosshair. This is a keyframe. It's called an adjustment keyframe. It's noted by this yellow square down here. If we move off of it, there's no longer a crosshair, meaning there's no keyframe there. there are gray keyframes. If I want to move this over time, make this track properly, all I have to do is move to another frame where it's not on, and then just click and drag it. You'll notice this bar turned red. And actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll make one more point somewhere in here, and click and drag. Where this is red, it hasn't been fully tracked. This means that we have tracked it, but then we made an adjustment, so the track needs to be updated. To update the track, just press track all again, and what it's going to do is it's going to look at each of the adjustment points, so this one, and I'm just going to press the K key to move to my next adjustment point, and then the K key twice again to move to the next. And it's going to look at these three adjustments, and it's going to track between the three and try to do a smarter job following them. Now if we take a look, that's on there and it's doing a much better job tracking. There are still points where it goes completely out of the frame and it's confused, and maybe it doesn't know where to go right here because it's noticing the top of this texture stayed the same, but the bottom is looking different. And the point is, you can go through either with the arrow keys or by clicking and dragging here to adjust the time slider and creating more adjustments. J and K are useful because they'll go between the midpoints of keyframes, so I'm pressing J here to go back, and you'll notice that goes to the midpoint between my two adjustment keyframes down here in the timeline. From here, I can use the W, A, S, and D keys that feel very similar to arrow keys and make an adjustment like that. I can also just push the arrow keys and use W, A, S, and D to make my adjustments. And this is how you would manually improve a difficult track where the texture is going in and out of frame and changing shapes. If you hover your mouse down here, you'll see you have different options. The adjustment keyframes are down here. So if for whatever reason you decided that in animation you might say, okay, this is looking good. If you wanted to add an adjustment, you could just add one right here without actually having to click it and move it. You can also go to a point and say maybe it doesn't look correct. Well, this one is correct, but whatever. If we wanted to, we could go here and press delete adjustment. I'll undo that. And then you can also delete all adjustment points for the selected point or as many points as you have selected. You can also try different tracking algorithms. For example, if I wanted to change the tracking scale and I wanted to try it at a higher scale, we can explain this in a different video. You can delete all of the base keyframes. So these gray keyframes are base keyframes. Now watch what happens when I press this, delete all base keyframes. Now those keyframes are gone. We can regenerate these keyframes by pressing track all. And here where there are no keyframes, you'll see that now they're created. Anyway, if you do that enough times with enough points, you'll get something like this. In this shot, let's say that we wanted to track this logo. It's starting off screen and then ending off screen. So what I would always recommend when you start any shot is just create and track one point. Let's do that. And again, we can select this point to stabilize it, which will make this a lot easier to see. Okay, so that's tracking just fine. But the problem is, when this point goes off screen, it's no longer moving. Same with on this side. So the way we deal with a point moving off screen is that it's going to have to follow the reference motion of other points. So put simply, let's just create 2 more points in here, or whatever. Let's just create 2 points there, and I'll let those track. As we move forward here, you'll notice that this point is seeming to move correctly as it moves off screen. Well, the way it's doing it is you can see that it's connected with this yellow line. These are guide point links. And when it runs out of keyframes, it's going to follow other points as far as it can. So if we have just this point selected, let's take a look down here. All of these gray keyframes are tracking keyframes. See where this is light blue? As we move through, this has its own keyframes that it's tracked in the shot. And then when we get to the point where it's dark blue, this is an interpolated keyframe, meaning that, okay, it can't track anymore, it was out of frame, it didn't have the right data, whatever. So it's going to look to other light blue points. I say that these are the tracking points that are alive, this is the point that's dead, and it's going to follow, and it's going to represent that new motion created through interpolation as a dark blue keyframe and as a dark blue point. And then finally, when there's nothing left to follow, let's just have that selected, it's black, meaning that there's no tracking data. Again, if I just go create a point here, I'm going to shut off interpolation. You can see that there's no tracking data to the left or to the right. That's all that means. So let's take a look at a couple different tracking types quickly. With this point selected, interpolation is on by default to 2 point. If we set it to 1, this can be useful for certain shots. See how it's not following that motion as well? It's just following this in a positional sense. And you'll see we get an advantage when you use 2 point interpolation. So now this is a little bit more in line with where it would have been. And then we have planar interpolation, which only works when you have 4 or more points and they're mostly in a planar arrangement. So as this point goes off screen, we may get to this point here where, let's say for example, we were trying to track a texture to the entire shoe. Well, now there's nothing else to track and this is a problem. And you might have a little bit of trouble tracking some of these smaller areas on the lower resolution tracking modes, and you just want to get it done. So one of the cool things about interpolation is that it's going to respect both base keyframes, again that's the gray keyframes that were actually tracked, and adjustment keyframes. Sometimes when I just need to get something off screen in a reasonable way, I'll just create a new point, control clicking, and there's an adjustment key. And then I'll move to the next frame and just kind of drag that over and drag that over. And now this has keyframes all the way to the end of the shot. And you can see what's happening here is now that this point exists, this point is following it, this point is following it. And if we wanted to, again, we say that this point goes off screen here and we want it to move off reliably, I can control click and create another point here, and then I'm going to move over to that last frame, and now this point has 2 points to follow. You may notice when you select it, it's only following 1, and that's because when you have hundreds of thousands of points, it can take a while to recalculate. If you want to reset your interpolation, there's 2 ways. You can press reapply interpolation, and then it's going to update and recalculate the interpolation for every point. Now this is properly showing 2, or you could just switch it off and on again. So if we take a look at this point here, it may have a little difficulty tracking on the lower resolution, lower accuracy transfer mode, and that's going to be a big consideration because of how long tracking can take on long shots. If we wanted to track something that was being stubborn, the cool thing about interpolation is it kind of gets it most of the way there for you. So see how because this is interpolating and following these 2 points, it's already almost where it needs to be. Let's zoom in, and what I'll do is I'll just go every couple of keyframes and just kind of make a rough guess on where it's supposed to be. And that point is pretty effectively tracked without doing any actual tracking. Now keep in mind where this is dark blue, it doesn't have any keyframes. If this looks exactly how you want it, there are 2 ways you can do this. One is that you can just lock it, and that's not bad. But the problem with this is that the interpolation on it might change as you add new points and recalculate. So let's just select that point and unlock it. I don't know if I mentioned, but the lock is going to make it so a point does not participate when you press track all or either of the tracking buttons. But that's what that's for. So probably the best thing to do when a point is looking really good and you don't want it to change is to press this bake button. So right here when I select this point now has gray keyframes instead of blue keyframes. This means that these keyframes cannot change, and also it's been locked, so now it's brown, just hitting this little lock pad switch, so that way it won't participate in the tracking process again, which I can prove if I just press track. You'll see that this point here, which was trying to follow the tip of this shoelace, has gone and tracked and created pure chaos. So that was no good. If we want to delete all those extra keyframes, these gray keyframes, we can just press this delete all base keyframes button, and that kind of brings back the sanity there. And again, this isn't following along. We would have to press reapply interpolation. And finally, we might want to take this keyframe and just say, okay, this is a border keyframe. This is just something that's going to be on the outside of the mesh. We might just want to pull it away from the mesh. It doesn't have to follow the shoelace. That doesn't really make a ton of sense for what we're trying to do here. But just keep it outside of the mesh. Like that. And then again, we would just bake it. As I progress forward with any shot, there's going to be points that I consider done and completed. So again, maybe what I would do is, as a final look, I would just look at this point and say, yeah, that's pretty much exactly where I want it to be. Now, with the speed this is moving, we would never need to get this precise, but if I really wanted to, I can move in here and use these keys to make this excessively precise. That is silly on 4K footage with motion blur. But you could do it. But we'll say this point is good. Let's watch this one. We'll say this point is good. And we'll say this point is... Actually, that's not... Well, it's tough to see. Maybe this does move a little bit more this way. At any rate, what I would do is I would take these points here and I would say bake. Those are done. I never want them to change again. And this one, we're not sure. So let's imagine we're putting some stripes on this shoe. We probably want our mesh to be expanded all the way to the border all around the shoe. So in order to do that, I'm going to hold down Control, Alt, Shift, and click. And I'm going to create these points, which we just call expansion points. Now, really what an expansion point is it's just creating a point which has an adjustment and then locking it. So to create an expansion point, you could also just Control click and then you have a point here. The problem with this is if I go to press Track All, this point is going to be tracking in the scene. So see how it's following on the road there. That's not what we wanted. So I'll just delete that or press Delete Base Keyframes. And then with this point selected, we can press Lock. And that's going to ensure that it doesn't participate in the tracking process. And again, as we go through, you'll see it's not moving. That's because interpolation is created as the point is created, and then we just deleted all of those keyframes. We can press Reapply Interpolation, and now that point is going to move properly. So now we've created a boundary around this shoe. I'm just going to press Auto Triangulate to create a mesh, and let's just see how that's moving. Before we move forward with the tutorial, I just want to see how this is actually applying and how a texture would look on this shoe. So let's set a lockdown mesh frame here. This seems like as good of a frame as any. Close lockdown and press lockdown. So that's following pretty well. I'm actually just going to do some quick and dirty roto. Now, to be clear, we could absolutely do the roto inside the lockdown stabilized comp, but I don't want to throw too much at you too soon, so I'm going to do a dirty roto brush here, which is actually a ridiculously incredible tool. And let's see how roto brush did. Roto brush did a really, really great job tracking this shoe. I'll freeze it. And I'm going to take this lockdown layer, which is the texture, and I'm going to track mat it to roto brush, keeping it inside of there. Wow, this is moving really, really fast. But if we move through this slowly, you can see that it's tracking that texture on there pretty well. I'm just going to add a pattern quickly. So to do that, I would go into the stabilized comp. I would delete this checkerboard. I've actually started to delete this lowest layer here. I feel like it's not too useful. It's just good for context when something goes wrong. And I'm going to take these watercolor patterns and I'll just put that over the shoe. And then maybe on this layer, which is my layer that has lockdown, I'll set this to overlay. Anyway, it's funny how even with 3 points, when you have a shot that's moving this fast, it kind of works. I should have realized it was a bad idea to let that mask apply to both shoes. Okay, this should look a lot better now. Let's get back into this shot. This is a very fast moving shot, and what you'll see pretty often is that when you have a lower resolution and lower quality tracking mode, as you try to track towards the edges, so for example maybe down here where there's not a lot of contrast, I'll just select this point. It has a good chance of getting lost. Now, yes, you could increase the resolution, and yes, you could go to the extremely accurate mode, but even that's not going to work all the time on tough footage. So how do we deal with a shot that's moving so fast you can barely see it, and it's giving the tracker trouble?
There's something called the Stabilize Tracking tab. To use this, first you need to create a lockdown mesh UV frame. And now let's take a look at the Stabilize Tracking tab. So in this tab, when we click this, you'll see, make a mental note of how this is shaped on the lockdown mesh UV frame. This is where your UVs are. And what's happening is it's going to hold the footage still based on the points that you have tracked. And the first most important thing about this tab is it's going to let you see how well your mesh is being tracked and stabilized. So one of the things you can do is if you play this, if you hover your mouse over any section in the shot or put your finger on the screen, whatever, you'll see, all right, so this mouse is being held pretty still compared to the texture I'm looking at. Probably don't need to add any more tracking data there. Then we can move it over here. And this is not still. This point, whatever this lace hole is moving around the mouse. We probably need to track it. Over here is looking fine. And then up here is just chaos. So let's go ahead. I'm going to create a new point here. And the funny thing is, sometimes things track better in this tab because it's looking at the motion of the stabilized shot. So for example, this is only moving maybe 10-20 pixels around in the shot when we're in the Stabilize tab. Out here in the main tab, if we were trying to look at that, if it's trying to track, it's moving a lot as it goes per frame, like pretty large motions. Large enough that, again, if you're trying to follow that, it's kind of nauseating. And that's why we do so much stabilization stuff in Lockdown, to make it so your eyes don't get tired and you feel sick every time you look at the shot moving quickly. Fun fact, not to digress too much, but if we just move through here, we can move through this much faster than real time. I'll hide the mesh. And we could go ahead and make adjustments here really, really efficiently. So in the same way we can do that here out in the main tracking tab, maybe I'm just going to delete this point and go do it again. In this Stabilize tab, we can create a point and move through. And we can also just make some adjustments. And without actually even tracking anything, I mean, we can get a really good track on this. I know you didn't come here to do manual keyframing. No one buys tracking software for that purpose. But anyway, the point is, this is something that can get you out of really difficult spots, which is why I'm demonstrating it, because when you have something that's just completely chaotic, this is a really good way to do it. So we have a point that's gone bad here, actually. It looks like this keyframe didn't track that well. That's another good thing about the Stabilize Tracking tab. If you go back and forth between two frames that are tracking properly, you'll see there's very little motion overall. But then if we go back and forth between two frames that aren't, there's a lot of motion. To deal with this kind of thing is usually easier to solve in the main tab. If I go back here, you can either delete the keyframes to the left using this button, and that should be totally suitable. Or I'll just undo that. So this had one bad keyframe of tracking. What you can do is you can use these keys to set trackable and non-trackable. And there's going to be more in the tutorial about this later. But just very quickly, the way this works is that the way you do this in your mind is you look at the texture. And right now, let's just not even look at the points. We have this X here, and we say, is this trackable? Is this on screen? So starting here, no, it's not. And then here on this frame, yes, it is. It's on screen. It's trackable. Moving forward, this is probably the last frame where it's trackable. And then here, it's off screen. So just to make a point, I can do this without even actually looking at the points and having them visible. And the way I would do that is this point is still selected. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the shot and say, all right, this is not trackable. If I hover over here in the bottom right, we can set a not trackable keyframe. What this does is it says from this point forward, where this black outline is, everything is not trackable. This would have to be interpolated. And then we can move forward and we can say, okay, so now this is trackable, right? We know that's there. We'll go down here and we'll say this is trackable. And again, moving forward from here, that's going to be trackable. It's locked too. I'll just unlock it so we can see the correct colors. But light blue meaning tracked, dark blue meaning interpolated. And we move through, and again, we're just looking at this X and looking at this X. And we say, okay, so from here, it's trackable. On this frame, it is not. And we'll set not trackable. So this top keyframe bar here is basically just saying Is the texture in the frame? No, no, no. Yes, 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 and no. And this is one of the most important things you can do to make sure that the tracker behaves properly and isn't creating keyframes where they're not supposed to be. And one small tip is that there is no motion blur right now with lockdown, but if you want to add it, you can just select the layer that lockdown is on, go to Effect, Time, CC Force Motion Blur. You always want your shutter phase to be -half of whatever your shutter angle was, so I'll make that -90. And if we zoom in here, now that texture is being motion blurred. However, remember we roto brushed this, so this actually has no motion blur on it. You probably want to turn that on roto brush as well. And actually, just looking at this shot, there's really not very much motion blur. That does not look like a 180 shutter. Let's just say maybe 90, 90, and -45. Even that looks extreme. Let's try 60. And -30. There. Maybe to really drive the point home, I'm just going to put a word on there. Okay, I am sick of working with this shot. It's just too much chaos. It's too fast. But you can see that that works. I'm going to switch it up and find another shot for the rest of this tutorial. Let's take a look at the stabilized tracking tab. So if you have a shot like this, and again, kind of similar to the shoe, we'll track all. It's a little bit tough to look at some of these points in motion. Having them selected helps a lot, but it's tough to see all of them in context. So I'm going to make some expansion points using Control, Alt, Shift, and click all the way around what I want to track, and then I need to create a mesh. And now that this mesh has been created, we need to set a lockdown frame, which it will do for you automatically, but I think it's always a better idea to get in the habit of setting it yourself. So we'll set that, and then we'll go to the stabilized tracking tab. And again, in here, everything is being held more still. And this is where you can do some additional tracking. So if I wanted to track here, I can create a point and maybe move along. And it's usually a good idea to at least put something at the start and the end. And I'll do another point here. We're not going to go too crazy with this. We'll just do these points to show the general concept. And we'll press track all. So scrubbing along, this is great. You can see these points and you can go through, and again, using J and K, you can make any adjustments you might need. J and K to take you to different points in the timeline. But now you probably want to see these stabilized, but that won't happen because they're not part of the mesh. So if you go back to your tracking tab, you can clear the mesh, and then you can auto triangulate. And then again, I would highly recommend, you probably want to set your lockdown mesh again, just to be sure. And now this is all part of one mesh. And when you go back into the stabilized tracking tab, look at how all 4 of these points are stable, and it's making the video more and more stable so you can choose more points to track and stabilize. One note about stabilized tracking, I'm just going to create a handful of points on this shot. And let's track, and you'll notice that they all go off screen and they die appropriately when they go off screen. And everything is being interpolated, mostly pretty okay. This is actually a situation where we might want to use 1-point interpolation. So they just get pushed off screen and it keeps that mesh moving. Let's auto triangulate, take another look at that. Now here's an issue with stabilized tracking, is that you notice how as these go off screen, they die as they're supposed to. However, in the stabilized tracking tab, if I go to create a point here, let's maybe just lock these points. I'll have this point start tracking, and as it starts to go off screen, the black border might affect it and might push it, because The tracker is really just being fed an image that was created inside of these boundaries, and now it's seeing that black, and there's not all that much you can do about it. So what I would probably recommend is, if you're going to be doing tracking in the stabilized tracking tab, you would set trackable and non-trackable before you do it. So for this point here, set trackable, and then we'll say, okay, so as we're going, we know that about here it stops being trackable, and then press that button. And now when you go into the stabilized tracking tab, you can work with it, and it should be pretty helpful. You won't need to do this too often, but sometimes you need to really make a custom edge flow on your mesh. So control clicking and dragging is going to make a whole bunch of points. This might not be good. Command clicking and dragging on Mac. Sometimes you're going to control click to create points. So for example, I'll start creating points here. Building out the lips. You can auto triangulate, but you don't usually want to have triangles when you're bringing it into a 3D application. You usually want quads. So you could auto triangulate, and then you could alt click and drag to delete the triangles. That's one possibility. Or I'll just clear that mesh. You can select a point and then hold down Control and Shift and click another point and another, and so on. Command Shift click on Mac. Custom subdivision is great for making 3D objects like this one. It makes subdivision smoothing very predictable. In this shot, we're adding a pattern to a plain white dress, like you can see here. And to make this work, we need very precise control over our expansion points that are not on the dress, but are rather around it. Here's the finished mesh. I've gone through and deleted all the interpolated points, and now let's go recreate a few of them. If I want to create an interpolated point over here, I'm holding down Control Alt Shift and click, Command Alt Shift and click on Mac. We need to decide if we want to expand the mesh on the arm or on the body. How does the software know which points it should be following? Well, it can't know because this point is pretty much directly between. If we move forward, let's take a look. It took a point from each, probably because they were the closest. And now this is going to be a problem because if we have a texture trying to extend this direction, it's going to squash. And if it's trying to extend over the arm, it's going to stretch. So with custom interpolation, that all happens here in this menu. I can select this point and I'm going to press I, and you'll notice that this turns white and it just says that we are now setting custom interpolated points. And then I'm going to click on, let's just say 1 point. We'll say it should follow this point, and then I'm going to click anywhere where there's not a point. And notice how that yellow goes away, and now this is attached to just that 1 point. So now it's following the arm. This point has custom interpolation data, meaning that it's going to go against how everything else is being automatically interpolated. And to remove that, you can just select the point and press Remove Interpolation Data. And then it will go back to whatever the default was. If we want to make this follow a little bit more accurately, again, we can press I, or we can press Set Custom Points under the Custom Interpolation menu. And then we're going to click, and then Shift click, and then click off. And now you'll see that's following the arm there. If I wanted to make another point here to follow somewhere on the hip, I can press I, click, Shift click, and click off there. And now that's following those 2 points. So let me just, for example's sake, I'm just going to make 2 more points here. And then I'm going to continue the mesh. Maybe you would just auto triangulate at this point. I think I just want you to take a look at these custom points and see how they're moving. And now you can see that these 2 points that we created here are distinctly attached to the body and making good expansion for the body. And these 2 points here are distinctly attached to the arm and making a good expansion for the arm. So to finish the shot, you would just do that all around it. One last word on custom interpolation. Custom interpolation can work with 1 point, where it will just follow the position. Whenever you use 2 points, as we had mentioned before, it's going to follow the position, rotation, and scale of those 2 points, just the same way that it would here. 2-point position, rotation, and scale. And you can also use many points. So for example, if I wanted to use custom interpolation here, now this is going to follow the planar motion of those points. When you select more than 2 points, it takes all of them and it generates a planar motion to the best of its ability and applies that to the interpolated point. In a shot like this, if you want to track this tree, specifically this point right here, the bike is going to overlap. So if I were to go to track this, I can, let's just track forward and see what happens. It's going to get swept away. So there are a couple different ways to deal with this. The first is you could just let interpolation do its thing. So we have all these other points tracked up here, and this point is going to interpolate, and whatever, that's not bad. And then you could go through and you could say, all right, so this is where I want it to be, and I'll go to the last frame and move that there. And without doing any tracking, you can just use the points around it to do a pretty good job. But of course, if this thing is visible, then why not track it on the frames where it can be tracked? So the best way to deal with this, to deal with any overlapping object situation, is to use the trackable, non-trackable keys that we mentioned earlier. So always go to the first frame and then choose one of these 2 keys. I would say always, always, always start on the first frame. We'll say, yes, this is trackable. Click that. And then move forward, and then maybe here is the last frame where it's trackable, and then we'll go here and say, nope, not trackable. And then move forward, and then here it is trackable again. So now this point isn't going to track from this frame to that frame. It will just interpolate. So I'll press track all. And now that's looking good. If you ever find yourself in trouble where things don't feel like they're working in this situation, the best thing you can do is, first thing you have to check is just make sure that the trackable and non-trackable frames are perfect. And then I would recommend going over here and deleting all of the base keyframes, because if this wasn't perfect and you managed to track with some of that overlap, you may not be able to get rid of those keyframes when you track again. They just may persist. So whenever there's an issue, it's probably a pretty good idea to delete all base keyframes. As a reminder, base keyframes can pretty much be regenerated any time because these adjustment point keyframes, the ones with the crosshairs on them, remain permanent and they don't get deleted when you press that button. And the software is going to try to track between this one and that one and try to find a reasonable path. Another option, which I actually probably wouldn't really recommend as much as setting the trackable and not trackable keyframes manually, but this can work too. So let's say that we know we're trying to track this tree and we know that this guy is going to be an overlapping object. I have a mask here. Now, the issue is we can set this to subtract. And yes, this would work, but this might interfere with the tracker a little bit. It might be hard to see what's going on when you go into lockdown. So let's just go into lockdown. And well, that's kind of tough. You can't really see what's going on. So that's not ideal. What you can do is you can go here, and I'm going to make a mask over this whole scene. So this first one is set to subtract. In this next one, we'll just have this add the opacity. It has to be underneath 50% is the real key. So when lockdown is looking at an alpha value, anything that's underneath 50%, it's going to say, okay, nothing that tracks in here, we allow to continue tracking. This is an overlap, and it stops tracking. Anything over 50%, it will just continue tracking like nothing happened. So set this to under 50%. I'll just say 40%. And now watch what happens. I'll place a point here, and I'll track forward. And as soon as that point gets into this region, it says, okay, no more tracking. The other thing I can do is I can grab this point, go past the occlusion, place another adjustment point here, and set it to track. So in short, you want your adjustment points before and after the occlusion in the shot. And of course, this doesn't know what to do. You notice that this point is basically just gone. So even when I have it selected, you'll see it's not really going to be moving. It's just going to be doing a straight interpolation from this last base keyframe over to here. So we need something that can interpolate this along while it doesn't have any keyframes to track. So again, you would just create another keyframe and track that. And here's the result. One thing I would recommend is that you make this mask quite a bit wider than it has to be, because this mask isn't actually changing what's being sent to the tracker. This mask is just saying, if this tracks and lands in this low alpha region, stop it from tracking further. But the tracker can actually still see whatever is behind the mask. So if this mask is too tight to this guy's face, when he gets over to here, there's a chance that, even from here on, this might start following the guy's face, even though it is masked. It's a long story why we did that. It made things much more efficient and faster from a processing side, but I can understand there's a slight downside there. To compensate, pretty much just make this mask a little bit wider if you're having issues, and it should solve it. Just for some context, here's a shot where I did those exact same steps, and you can see everything works out. The lockdown mesh frame determines which frame you paint on. So for example, any of these frames you can choose as a starting point, and the plugin will choose one automatically for you if you don't. But just so you know, this green bar represents which frame that lockdown mesh frame is on. So for example, if I go here to this frame, I can press set lockdown mesh UV frame and click that. Notice how the green bar moves. Now this is the hero frame right here. When I move into the stabilized UV layout tab, watch this shape, watch these four corners. Notice how they don't move. And as I scrub through here, you can see this video is stabilized based around this mesh. If I go back to the beginning of the video, this button doesn't work when I'm in any of these tabs. I can return to the tracking tab, press set lockdown mesh UV frame, and then stabilized. You can see that shape is preserved. It's very small here because it's small on this frame. So I chose the worst frame possible for this example because I just want to point something out. If I press lockdown now, I can go into my stabilized comp, I can delete the checkerboard, and you can see this layer represents the frame at which we stabilized on, and this here is the actual stabilized video. So I can put my graphics here, and now I can move back to the main comp, and I'll play this. So one of the things you might notice is this isn't very sharp. That's because it's taking a small image here, and then it's blowing it up. So choosing your lockdown mesh frame is important. When you're in lockdown and you choose the frame, it probably makes sense to choose the frame in which your mesh is the biggest. So I'll press this here, set lockdown mesh UV frame. And now when I come back, you'll see that this is all moved on me. If I move into the stabilized comp, you'll notice that none of this has been updated. In order to get it to update, I have to press lockdown again on the main lockdown layer. Now I can enter the stabilized comp, and you can see what this looks like. I can scale this up and put it in place. And when I move back, you can see that this is perfectly sharp. So in summary, inside of the pop-out, you can choose which frame is your lockdown mesh UV frame, which is represented by a green bar. And that's the shape you'll see in the stabilized tab and in the UV tab. But what if there's never a frame that really properly represents what you're trying to do? So for example, if you take a look over here, there's never a frame where it would be good to create the lockdown hero frame. It's never quite facing a direction where you would want to work. So moving into the stabilized UV layout, let's just take a look at this. As a side note, because this is a planar track, I'm using single plane perspective warping. There is a different tutorial on that, please go check that out. The difference is it's going to make a plane render correctly at strange angles, as opposed to triangulating, and it will do this, and that can be a problem. So this is good for planes, check out more about that feature later. So if you can't find a frame that really properly represents whatever you're trying to add graphics to, this is what the UV tab is for, where you can grab any point on the mesh and you can just kind of move it around. So see how I can square up this wall here? All right, just like that. There. And again, I'll press lockdown, moving into my stabilized comp. At this point, the bottom layer is entirely worthless because this is only doing a freeze frame. You'd probably want to delete that. And you'll see that this has been stabilized just to match the view in the pop out. And you can place your graphics here. Something like that feels about right. And that's going to work out much better. Here's another shot where you may want to do custom UVs. So you can see, for example, the book is laid out like this, and there's never really a good frame. I could set my lockdown UV mesh frame wherever, but this isn't how I'd like to work, so I'd probably want to straighten this out. I'm going to just grab these points, and now you can see my UV layout for this book is straight and flat, where both covers are about the same size and laid out evenly. I'll press lockdown, and I actually already had graphics in there. So I'll hide those graphics, and you can see that this is laid out like this. And now it's pretty easy to just put something on top of this, flat and straight. And I've actually already done the keying here, but you get the idea. This is a situation where manually setting your UVs is going to make the shot easier to work with. And you can see how it all looks here. So let's look at the last few notes regarding the lockdown UV frame and the UVs. How do we undo this if we need to undo this? Well, these have been set custom, and it's just showing this filled circle right here. But if we want to move it back to its original position, which is wherever it was on this frame, on the lockdown mesh frame, we can select it and press clear UV, and it will go back there. Now it's blue instead of white. And if we want to reset all of it, clear all UV. I should probably rename these buttons, but they get the job done. In this shot, we're going to track arrow graphics to the road. The first step is to track and stabilize the video to build a stabilized plate we can animate on. Once that's done, we can animate on the stabilized plate and see those graphics tracked to the video. Let's get started. For a shot like this, the area you want to track is significantly longer than the size of the frame. So I'd recommend increasing the composition size. I'll just do so by 3 times. And setting a dead zone on this footage. To do that, create a rectangular mask and duplicate it. Set the second mask to subtract, invert it, and make the expansion about 20 pixels or so. And set the opacity to around 60 so you can still see it, but it's semi-transparent. This semi-transparent area is called the dead zone. It will tip off the tracker to stop points from tracking as it gets close to the edge of the frame. Anything less than 50% opacity, as you see here, as soon as a point enters it, it will stop tracking. And just because I know I'm going to get a bunch of comments about this, 60% actually means it's 40% opacity because we're subtracting, not adding. Okay, moving on. Pre-compose the footage, moving it all into a new comp. Then apply lockdown. I don't need to use so many points. I'm going to increase the lasso grid pixel distance and draw roughly around the land. And press track all. You can see the points are being terminated as they reach the edge of the frame. At the start of the footage, you can see there's plenty of area that isn't tracked, so we'll go ahead and add more points here. And same with the end of the footage. Control clicking and dragging to create the points, by the way. Command clicking and dragging on Mac. Sometimes I don't mention these details, I'm sorry. And I'll press track all again. So now to see this whole mesh as one, let's turn on interpolation. This shot is mostly planar, so we'll use the unified plane interpolation mode. And we want this roughly centered. Maybe I'll just clear the mesh and auto-triangulate again. And I'll press Set Lockdown Mesh UV Frame because this is the shape of the mesh we'll want to actually paint on. I'll take a closer look, and I think the only points that might be having a little bit of trouble are the ones that the car is directly overlapping. So maybe these four right here. I'll just delete those. These won't be too consequential, and we can auto-triangulate again. And let's go back to After Effects. I'll press lockdown, and you can see that the texture is tracking. In order to make this look sane, let's bring this back to its correct proportions. I'm going to select all of the layers, pre-compose, moving all attributes into the new composition. We'll just call this working comp. And then in this composition here, let's set this back to 1920 by 1080. So now with this cropping, this is just showing the original shot, and of course we have this texture tracked. Let's go into the stabilized pre-comp, which has all of our graphics. We definitely don't need this checkerboard. And actually, this bottom layer is probably not relevant. This is just a freeze frame for reference. We can delete that. And let's scrub back and forth and see what's happening. So this is pretty cool. This is showing the shot in segments totally stabilized so you can paint on it. One thing that can be very helpful is to duplicate this layer over a couple of times so you can see the entire texture while you're working. Let's make this layer not a guide layer. And rather than just duplicate the layer and start moving it over in time to expand, it's probably more efficient to pre-compose it. So right now, if I did this, I have two layers which each have an instance of lockdown, and lockdown has some processing weight. So it's probably better to take this layer, pre-compose, move all attributes into the new comp, and then duplicate it, and then you can move these over in time. And see the full range of the shot. So what I've done is in this middle, I have the last frame lined up here and the first frame lined up, and that is the whole texture of the shot there. I'll take these two, we can just take these and go time, freeze frame, and now as we play through, this top layer is showing the actual video, and then the two bottom freeze frames are just good reference. And it probably makes sense to have one more freeze frame in the middle too. So now I'm going to add some graphics. I'm not going to show exactly how to create them, but basically you would take this texture, bring it into Cinema 4D, and animate arrows along a path. There are also plenty of ways to do it in After Effects. I just happen to like Cinema. I've taken the render from Cinema 4D and made a pre-comp out of it. I don't necessarily need to get into that step because I feel like this kind of graphic has been created many times. But just so you can see it, I did one version where the arrows aren't moving, they have a slight light sweep effect, and another where the arrows are moving. We'll get started with the ones where they aren't first. And this background doesn't actually need to render, we just need the graphic, and we can do the compositing and the other compositions. I'll make these guide layers. For the three still frames, let's just turn their opacity down. In this one remaining layer, shows the actual footage moving in the stabilized pre-comp. I know this is kind of hard to imagine, but this block is actually showing what the camera is seeing in the shot, and when it's stabilized, it just sweeps across the whole stabilized landscape. I'll undo that opacity change. I'll set this to add, and I'll add some glow. And let's take a look at it in the main comp. So there you have it. The arrows are tracked to the road. Let's also take a look at the variation where the arrows are moving. And as a reminder, you can apply graphics to any part of the shot that's been tracked. My team and I have developed an inside joke where we do the puppy test, where we just throw pictures of puppies all over an image to make sure everything looks like it's tracking properly. You can see that you can track any part of this video. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.
Let's do a fast overview of 3D, but not get too deep into it. The first thing you need is to have a tracked mesh in the tracking tab. You can't do anything without a mesh. Let's head over to the 3D tab. At this point, I'd like you to humor me, and if you're testing this on your end, try to follow these same steps. The first thing I want to do is remove all of the 3D from the image. So I'm going to change the 3D depth multiplier to 0. I'm going to set the smooth interval to 0. And I'm going to disable Use 3D Planar Tracker and attach plane to mesh. Now, if I hold down Alt, click and drag, just like the controls in Cinema 4D, I can move around this in 3D. Middle mouse click is going to pan, right is going to zoom. And this is totally 2D at this point. From here, there's nothing I can do to interact with this mesh. You can only interact with the mesh when you reset the camera view. You can see these blue points and you're in 2D. We will very likely support 3D interactions eventually. So if I wanted to attach something here in Cinema 4D, I can select one point and create a transform. Or for whatever reason, I can select 2 points, create a transform. Or I can select 3 points. So again, this is totally flat. Let's export it to Cinema 4D, just for example's sake. I'll press the Export 3D button. The C4D exporter is completely automatic and works really well. The Alembic exporter doesn't include projection information or textures, so it's a little more work. We'll get into that in another video. If I leave this checked, all this background footage is going to come into Cinema 4D too. I'll press Export. This is just a folder on my desktop. And save. This process is much slower when you export frames, but hopefully you only have to do that once. Here's the folder I exported to. You'll notice there's a text folder, and in here is my image sequence. I'll open the C4D file, and here's my shot, all in 2D. If I want to attach something to my transforms, they're inside of this list, under Mesh Attachments. I'll create a new object, and I'll parent a copy to each of these, and then zero out position and rotation. You can see this is animating here, and we can look at this through the scene camera. You'll notice that this point on the 3D transform is actually scaling up and down as it goes. If we move back into After Effects, remember, this has no depth in it. I can select this transform and reset my camera view, and you can take a look at these 3 points. And you'll notice that because the way the liquid is moving, this actually is scaling up and down. The size of this triangle is shrinking and growing. So when you don't have any depth, it makes sense that there's scale applied to the animation. You can always grab these keyframes and delete the track. So I just wanted to bring that up as an option you have. Now, of course, no one came here to do 2D tracking in Cinema 4D, so let's add some depth. In the 3D tab, I'll Alt-click and drag and go to the side, and then we can bring up our 3D depth mesh multiplier. You basically set it until it looks about right. There are a lot of different controls in here, which I'm going to get into in the full-length tutorial. Now, when I export this again, I probably don't want to export the frames again because I already have them. But of course, the problem here is that when I use this to overwrite my scene file, all the work I did is gone. So in the full-length tutorial, we'll talk about how to solve that. Let's take a look at Lockdown's planar tracker using this shot to start. When you enter the 3D tab, you'll see this box. What is it for? This box is a planar tracker that's going to attempt to move your mesh in 3D space. I'll go into my 3D view. Please check out the previous tutorial on the homepage if you're not sure what these controls are. And I'm going to disable my 3D planar tracker and disable the function to attach the mesh to the plane. If I scrub through, you can see that the shape of this head actually looks pretty good. But you'll notice he's not walking towards us like he was in the video clip. The depth estimator we're using is more concerned with the shape than it is with the distance over time. This is because this depth estimator creates its calculations looking at individual frames and not considering the whole video. But the depth estimator we're using is relatively lightweight and seemed to be a good idea considering all the other tools we have. So how do we make this actually move forward and backward in space? We use the 3D planar tracker. So let's enable it. And to make things less confusing, I'm going to shut off the depth estimator. So now this is just completely flat. As I play back, you'll see the 3D planar tracker is moving through 3D space. That's this box. At the beginning of the clip, when the tiger is far away, this box is far away, and it moves forward until the tiger moves forward, until it reaches the frame. Here's the footage, just so you can see by comparison, roughly how far the tiger is moving. So as mentioned in the other tutorials, you can't interact with anything or touch it when you're in this 3D view. So clicking and dragging, that won't do anything. Just press the reset camera view button, and then you can click and drag and move this around. The way it works by default is you find your mesh, and you take this box, and you place it somewhere logical around the center of your mesh. You can also only move it when you're on your hero frame, because that's the starting point of the track. The hero frame is represented by the two green boxes in the bottom right on the timeline. Then by default, the planar tracker is going to use all of the points in the shot and say, if this was a plane, where would it be moving in 3D space under this field of view? This button, Recalculate 3D Track, lights up every time you change the position of the planar tracker or anything that affects it, and that reminds you to press it to recalculate. It only takes a few seconds, but if you're playing with these dials and knobs and you have to wait 4 seconds for it to recalculate before every single time you touch one of them, it can get annoying, which is why we make you press it when you're done. The only exception to this is the camera field of view, and for reasons I won't necessarily get into, things would go crazy if it didn't recalculate for you whenever you made changes here. So I don't actually know what the field of view was or what the lens was, but I'm just guessing that 30 degrees is closer than the default 54 degrees. And you can see this plane moving back in space, and this distance is going to be completely different depending on what the field of view is. I'll make it 20, and you'll notice it's further back. So how do you know what the right field of view is? I'm going to use the Attach Mesh to Plane feature here, and the short answer is that you basically want this to be about the same size no matter where it is in the scene, because heads don't change size. Just going by gut feel here, I feel like this looks pretty good. As of Lockdown 3.0, the only purpose of this planar tracker is to establish the depth of your mesh, meaning all we care about is the Z position of the object. And I wouldn't consider this planar tracker valid for tracking the rotation of the plane, even though you do see it rotating as it moves. I'm going to unattach the mesh so you can look at this plane a little bit easier, and you'll see that it's rotating in ways that don't make a lot of sense. Especially right there, where when you look at the footage, its head is not doing that. And I feel this needs to be explained why this isn't working, and that's because its head is not a plane. And a lot of these points that are being tracked, the nose is probably pretty close to us, the head is far back, and the tool is unable to resolve a true planar motion from points that are non-planar. If you take a look at this shot that uses the planar tracker, you'll notice that it tracks really well. But that's because all the points in this shot are absolutely planar. We made a very good guess at the size of the box, and we made a very good guess at the field of view of the camera. Here's an experiment where I look like a total dork, but I did have the field of view of the camera and all the measurements, so everything looks perfect. Hopefully in the future we can improve on this tool so it's easier to get results like this. So just know that we'll very likely include planar tracking features in the future, but for all of your shots that are not planar, this tool is only good for setting depth. So we'll attach this mesh back to the plane. Now we need to actually give this tiger's face shape, so let's put our depth multiplier back on. And again, I think that looks about right. I'll reset the camera view. One of the things to know about the planar tracker is you can't click it, select it, move it if you're not on the hero frame. You're going to set its initial position on the hero frame using these controls, or just clicking and dragging, and then the tool looks at the positions of the points and attempts to follow them. Sometimes you'll have a shot where you're trying to track this whole character, and the character consists of several independently moving planes. I've drawn loose boxes around them here, and there's the motion. Obviously the arms are moving separately from the body. I'll go to the 3D tab. So it depends on what I'm trying to add this shot, but I may want to focus on the arm, or the bicep, or the back, or whatever. So if I wanted to attach this plane to the arm, I would select the points of the arm, and press Set Hero Plane Points, move the plane over, and press Recalculate 3D Track. And you can see that this plane is now moving with the arm. And if I wanted to have this work with the body, which is probably what you would do the vast majority of the time, I can select these points, press set hero plane, recalculate 3D track, and now that plane is attached there. Last part, if you want to use 2 points to establish depth in your scene, for a shot like this, where the car is moving forward and backward in space rather than scaling up and down, you can do that with the 3D planar tracker. You may think, let's head over to the 3D tab, move the box to where it's supposed to be, select these 2 points, and press set hero plane points, and it will give you an error saying it requires at least 4 points. In the future, I know we'll be able to automate this, but for now, you just have to feed it 4 points. So let's go back into the tracking tab, and I'm going to hold down Ctrl-Alt-Shift and click, and create 2 expansion points here. If I select these points, they're receiving their motion by following these existing points. Check out the tutorial on interpolation if this isn't perfectly clear. Now, I don't actually need to make a mesh, but you can see that there are 4 points here. So this is valid for planar tracking. I'll head into the 3D tab and press set hero plane points and recalculate 3D track. Now when I move over the top here, we have Z motion. Whenever you're doing a 2-point track, it probably makes sense to turn off the 3D depth mesh multiplier. When you export this to After Effects or Cinema 4D, the null object will be called hero plane. Alright, I think that's enough on planar tracking. Let me know if you have any questions, and rest assured this will probably be one of the first things we make improvements to after a couple weeks of testing. Creating transforms is very easy, but we do have to go over it. To create transforms, you can select 1 point, like this one right here, and press create transform. You can also select 2 points, so I'll select these 2, create transform, and then to have something more reliably attached to the mesh, you can select 3 points. That's all there is to it. I'll close the pop-out, and I'll press 3D to AE. I'm going to remove the clutter and just disable lockdown for a moment. If I want to attach something to these transforms, text for example, I can just parent it to the null. I'll duplicate my text and attach it to my 2-point transform here, which has position, scale, and rotation. And usually it's a good idea to zero out your position. So the 1-point transform follows position, the 2-point has position, rotation, and scale. 1 and 2-point transforms are just 2D tracks with no 3D, no depth. And finally, if we want to do a 3D track, or use a 3D object in newer versions of After Effects coming out soon, we can parent this to our 3-point transform, make sure it's a 3D object, and then definitely zero it out. As far as the rotation goes, you might have to play with that a little bit. I just turned the grid back on so you can see that this text is attached to this polygon. Now let's take a shot into Cinema 4D. For example's sake again, I'm going to create a 1-point transform, a 2-point transform, and 3-point. I'll press export, and I want it to export the video of the elephant with the Cinema 4D file, so I'll keep this checked. Here's the exported C4D file. There's a text folder containing all the frames of my video. And you can see everything is set up automatically. We can look in our hierarchy and we can see our mesh attachments. But one thing I want to point out is that I can parent objects to these mesh attachments. I'll zero out the position and rotation. And when I play through this, the depth is actually going to be inconsistent for the 1-point and the 2-point transforms. If I look at this scene from the top view, this plane right here is the default zeroed out distance for the mesh. And as I scrub, you'll notice that the 1-point transform and the 2-point transform don't move forward and backward in Z. But the 3-point transform does. I don't know if you caught it earlier, but for the 3-point transform, I actually used 3 points that were pretty far away from each other. You might make the assumption that to attach something to the surface, you would have to use 3 points that are connected as a face. Now, to get the best attachment, perhaps that's true. But the reason I wanted to point out that you're not limited to that and that you can choose any 3 points is there might be times where there's an advantage to doing so. This mesh isn't very dense. I believe that if I chose these 3 points instead of the 3 that were far apart, everything would be perfectly smooth and look great. That being said, if the points were much closer together, once they get so tight together, the small motions between them can have a huge impact on rotation. You might see some degree of rotation flicker if these points are really, really tight. So just explaining that you don't need to select a face, and you can always try to select farther apart points if you think that will help. What you can take from this is 1 and 2 point transforms are best for 2-dimensional motion graphics. And to actually attach something to the mesh, I'll look through the camera here, you have to use a 3-point transform. I mentioned this in the other tutorial. By default, scale comes through on 3-point transforms. If we look at how these 3 points are moving, they are actually doing a slight scale because the skin is bending, because this isn't a plane. But we know that scale isn't something actually shrinking and growing. We know that scale is just coming from the elephant's skin bending. So in this case, you may want to delete this. And this should feel better. So what happens if you want to attach something anywhere on the mesh, not just where you created a transform? To show that, I've reverted back to the original project, and I'm going to create a null. I'll put an object in the null. Then I'll right-click, go to Rigging, and add a constraint tag. For priority, set it to Generator, go to Clamp. In your clamp settings, under 2, set it to Surface. Drag your mesh down into the target. Under As, set it to Normal. And for distance, drag this down to 0. Now when I click and drag this around, it's going to stick to the mesh based on its normal. Let's just zoom in there to show you. This is going to slide as it animates, and that's because by default this constraint is just constraining to the surface, but anywhere on the surface. You need to press lock position, and now that's pretty well attached. If I want to do multiple of these, on the tag I have to disable lock position, and it's really important that you don't scroll in time or everything is going to get offset and not be where it's supposed to. So disable lock position, and then I can hold down Control and click and drag. I think that's enough to make my point. And now with all of these tags selected, press lock position. And now everything is attached. And there's the result. The relighting workflow is actually really easy. In this shot, I've created a mesh across the whole frame, and I only really had it track over the character's face because I thought that was going to be important. The rest of these points, I believe, are just sitting there and interpolating. But the whole scene is one mesh. This is how it looks in the 3D tab. I'll go to Export 3D and create a C4D file. Here's the shot in Cinema 4D, and of course we need to actually add the light in here. To get the wand in there, I tracked a completely separate instance, just a different layer, and I had experimented with a few things, but I ended up really only using this last point on the top. But I did want to point out that this point is interpolating and following these 2 points, which tracked a little more easily. So to get this into Cinema 4D, I can take this point and press Create Transform, and then Export 3D, except I won't export the frames because I've already done that. I'll call it Light Point, and I'll open this up in Cinema 4D as well. It opens in a different scene file. There are no textures, that's okay. Let's go through and delete the stuff that we don't need. We don't need the mesh, and we don't need the background. And this null is where we would have had a planar hero transform, but we don't need that either. We just need this one single point. And I'll call this point light. Copy it. And move into my other scene and paste it. Let's put a sphere in here just so it's easier to see. And we can look through our main camera. So that's moving as it should. But the issue is it too close? Is it too far? Where is it relative to this mesh? Because as we had discussed in other tutorials, when you do a single point transform, it gets stuck on this line where z equals 0. But what if it was supposed to be a lot closer in front of her face, not next to her face? This is actually pretty easy to solve. We can scale down this whole group, but we have to do it from the perspective of the camera. I'm going to go into a 2 view side by side, because this will be confusing otherwise. And I'm going to create a new null. This null has to be at the position of the camera. So the easiest way to do that, I think, is to zero it out when you parent it under the camera. And now, see that null is where the camera is. Now let's take it out, and I'll just call this adjust scale. And I'll take my entire point light scene and parent it under there. So I'll press T, which is going to scale things, and let's just make sure that we're in object mode, not model mode, because that will destroy absolutely everything. And I want you to really pay attention to what's happening on the left side here, and what's happening on the right side here. As I scale this down, see how it doesn't look like it changes at all on the right side? That's because everything is aligned in perspective with the camera. When you scale down from the position of the camera, you can see the frustum here. It all stays aligned. I can't explain it, it just does. It's perfect, it's great. So let's actually put a light in here. I'll take this light and parent it under my 1 points attachment and zero it out. And I'll make the scale 1, I don't know if that really matters. And let's disable this sphere for now. So now, let's pay a little bit more attention to this view, and let's scrub along. You can see what's happening. We're getting some good relighting on the face. This would look better with shadows, by the way. So we can select this light, shadow. You should probably be using redshift and all the default settings in there, but I think this is nice to the people who have Cinema 4D Lite. I'll hit Ctrl R, and you can see how much better that looks when the shadows are calculating. So if we want to adjust the distance of this light, we can do that again just by scaling here and saying, okay, this is probably too close, now it's lighting the wrong side of her face. Or I can scale this way up. So maybe the easiest thing to do is just look at roughly where the wand is in here and scale it to about that distance. I'm not really sure theoretically the best way to do this, but I'll show you how I did it. I'm going to create a new material and put that on my mesh. This mesh is also a little bit rough. I'll put it inside a subdivision surface. I'm just holding down Option when I click that, by the way, to quickly put this in place of the mesh and then put the mesh under it. And this is what I want to render back to After Effects. I'll save this. Here's my wand file, and I'll just drag that in, and I'll place it at the top of my scene. It looks beautiful. For the camera, let's select the Cinema 4D camera, and both of these were exactly the same. Whatever. Right now it's set to viewport, set it to current. The main reason I'm showing this is because those of you with Cinema 4D Lite won't have the option to render. Your performance is probably going to be a lot better if you just render this to an image sequence first. I'm going to pre-compose this, moving all attributes into the new comp, and adjusting the composition duration. And I'll render this whole comp so we can work a little faster. So I'll just go back into this comp and take my MP4, place it over the top, and solo it. And I'm going to hide this for just a moment. So this is the footage. I'm going to duplicate it and remove lockdown. Maybe for simplicity, I should just delete all these other layers. And I'm going to turn this layer on top. And let's try screen for the blending mode. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm going to duplicate this wand layer and make a luminance mask. I'll go to Effect, Color Correction, Tint, and then Curves. In this part, you kind of just go by eye. So I'm going to say that I think I want the skin to have mostly the full effect, so it'll be pretty bright there, and then the hair to have almost no effect, because this might be the least profound and dumbest sounding thing I say. Bright things reflect more light, dark things reflect less light. So when it comes to our digital light that we're adding on, it should respect that and reflect proportionally to the surfaces we're already seeing in the scene. I'll take this lighting layer and set it as a luma matte. And there it is. So actually not too bad. If I want to give this some color, I'll go to Effect, Color Correction, Photo Filter, set it to Custom, and I guess I'll make it blue, whatever. And I feel like, because you're not blurring the luminance mask, this stays totally sharp. Instead, you're just blurring this layer, which doesn't really need a ton of detail. You can go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Box Blur. I'll turn my luminance matte back on. And you can soften out that shadow by faking it with a fast blur. Maybe let's try add instead of screen, so it'll be a little bit brighter. And here's the result. As for attaching something to the wand, check out the tutorials on the homepage, which will show you how to export points to the After Effects timeline. I think I'm going to keep these tutorials as short as possible, so I'm not repeating too much of the same information, and save you some time.